England, 1940. The air hums with the restless pulse of war. Inside a dim aircraft factory on the southern coast, the smell of oil and burnt metal hangs thick in the air. Rows of women in overalls bend over engine parts, hands blistered, eyes fixed, movements precise. The roar of test engines outside rattles the thin tin walls. Somewhere in the distance, the wail of an air raid siren cuts through the clatter of tools. But inside this hangar, no one looks up. At the far end of the assembly line, one woman pauses. A single metal washer, no larger than a coin, gleams under the harsh light. She turns it between her fingers, frowning, sensing something off. It's too rough, too uneven. She picks up a small file, smooths the edge, then fits it back into the assembly. Just another part, in another engine, on another day. But that small, perfect circle of steel, worth barely 50 cents, will soon help Spitfire pilots climb higher, dive faster, and survive battles that should have killed them. A moment of quiet. Then the engine roars to life, and the war in the skies changes forever. By 1940, Britain stood alone. France had fallen. Europe lay under the shadow of the swastika, and across the Channel, the Luftwaffe gathered like a storm. Every man, every woman, every machine was pulled into the fight for survival. The Royal Air Force, young, under-equipped, and outnumbered, faced the greatest aerial force in the world. At a Piedsadenhouders, the heart of that defense was a single aircraft. The Supermarine, Spitfire, sleek, deadly. A symbol of hope wrapped in aluminum, but beneath its graceful wings, the Spitfire carried a flaw. Its Merlin engine, though powerful, suffered from a weakness German pilots had already learned to exploit. In a steep dive, the engine's carburetor flooded with fuel, choking off power. The propeller stalled, the aircraft jerked violently, and the pilot, trapped in mid-dive, watched helplessly as the Bf-109s slipped past. Guns blazing. That moment of engine cutout meant everything. In the chaos of dogfights, even half a second could decide who lived and who burned. The Germans knew it. The British engineers knew it too. And somewhere deep inside the factories of Britain, someone was about to find an answer, not with new weapons, not with money or glory, but with something small enough to fit in the palm of a hand. The nation's factories became battlegrounds of their own, lit by sparks instead of tracers, fueled by sweat instead of aviation fuel. Tens of thousands of women entered them, many for the first time. Some built wings, others forged pistons, and a few, hidden in the corners of engine workshops, worked on components no one else cared to notice: washers, bolts, and valves. The war effort wasn't won by heroes in cockpits alone. It was held together by hands that never touched a trigger. One of those hands belonged to a quiet, methodical woman at a Rolls-Royce facility in Derby. She wasn't an engineer by title. She wasn't decorated or even mentioned in official records. But her persistence, her refusal to let a single defect pass, led to a small, mechanical correction that would save thousands of British pilots in the years to come. A washer, a perfect circle of steel. Born not from brilliance, but from obsession. And behind that obsession lay a simple truth. In war, perfection was the difference between life and death. By the summer of 1940, Britain's airfields were burning, hangars shattered, pilots exhausted, mechanics working by lantern light through the night. Every dawn brought the same ritual: the scramble bell, the roar of Merlin engines, and the rising thunder of the Luftwaffe crossing the Channel. It was the Battle of Britain, And while the Spitfire's silhouette became a symbol of defiance, inside every engine bay lurked the same deadly weakness. Whenever RAF pilots nosed their aircraft into a dive to chase German fighters, their engines sputtered. The Merlin's carburetor, designed for level flight, couldn't handle the sudden surge of negative G-forces. Fuel flooded the cylinders, starving the engine of air. For a moment, sometimes just 2 seconds, the engine died. That was all a BAF 109 pilot needed. The German Messerschmitts, fitted with advanced Bosch fuel injection systems, didn't suffer that problem. They could dive straight down, flip under, and attack while the Spitfire still fought to catch its breath. It wasn't a matter of courage. It was a matter of physics. Reports poured into Rolls-Royce and the Air Ministry. Pilots begged for a fix, anything to stop the stall, but the engineers were already overwhelmed, designing newer Merlin variants, building bombers, and repairing engines torn apart by combat. Every modification took weeks, often months, and required scarce materials the country could barely spare. Then, in late 1940, inside the Rolls-Royce workshop in Derby, one woman began noticing a pattern. She had spent months checking the tiny, precise parts of carburetors, the needle valves, the diaphragms, the washers, day after day. She inspected thousands of components under magnifying lamps, and one afternoon, while testing a fuel valve assembly, she saw something unusual, a momentary fluctuation in pressure, just as the carburetor sealed. To anyone else, it would have been a trivial imperfection. But she stopped the line, pulled the piece apart, and began experimenting. It wasn't design brilliance. It was instinct, repetition, and persistence. After countless adjustments, she replaced a key sealing washer with a slightly thicker one, adjusting the tolerance by less than a millimeter. When the engine ran again, the fluctuation disappeared. More importantly, under simulated dive conditions, fuel flow steadied. That single alteration, worth just 50 cents in wartime currency, would soon become known among engineers as the miracle fix. The woman's name was Beatrice Shilling, an engineer, racer, and perfectionist. Her small, improvised solution would change the war in the skies. But before it could save lives, it had to reach the front. And fast. The war's most effective invention didn't come from a laboratory. It came from a woman with grease on her hands, a stopwatch in her pocket, and no patience for excuses. Beatrice Shilling wasn't a typical engineer. Before the war, she was one of the few women to earn an engineering degree from the University of Manchester. She raced motorcycles in her spare time, setting records at Brooklands circuit, and carried the same fearless precision into her wartime work at Rolls-Royce. To the men around her, she was a curiosity. That lady engineer. To the pilots, who would later owe her their lives, she became something more. The mind that saved the Merlin. Her device, soon nicknamed Miss Shilling's Orifice by RAF mechanics, was deceptively simple. A small brass washer fitted inside the Merlin's carburetor fuel line. It limited the flow of fuel during dives, preventing the flood that caused engine stalls. It didn't solve the problem entirely, but it gave the pilots something they hadn't had since the war began: control, and that changed everything. For the first time, Spitfire pilots could dive after Bf 109s without their engines cutting out. They could push negative G-forces, stay on target longer, and strike back. The fix didn't add horsepower. It didn't make the plane faster, but it gave back confidence. That invisible weapon every pilot needed to survive. Technically, it was an interim measure, a stopgap until full fuel injection systems could be developed. But in war, Stopgaps often decide survival. Shilling's small brass washer turned frustration into fury, fear into precision. And within weeks, she was on the road herself, visiting airfields across southern England, installing the fix by hand. No orders, no entourage, just a toolbox, a small satchel of washers, and the determination to make sure no pilot died because of a preventable flaw. Her invention spread across the RAF like wildfire. By early 1941, almost every Spitfire and Hurricane carried her modification. And in the skies above the Channel, the Luftwaffe began noticing something strange. The British fighters were no longer backing off in dives. They were staying on them, climbing faster, turning harder, fighting back with a vengeance. It was a silent revolution, born not in a lab or a boardroom, but in the oil-slick corners of a wartime workshop. The brass washer, less than an inch wide, began to reshape the balance of air combat. But it's true. Impact went beyond engineering. It had changed the way pilots trusted their machines and themselves. Before the fix, Spitfire pilots flew with hesitation. Every time they banked hard or dove after a Messerschmitt, a shadow of doubt followed. They knew the risk. One wrong maneuver, one burst of negative Gs, and the engine would choke, leaving them gliding helplessly while the enemy fired back. That moment of hesitation had cost lives. After Beatrice Shilling's modification, that hesitation was gone. Squadron reports from the spring of WWII, 1941, began to note an almost psychological shift. Pilots described the aircraft as alive. Again, flight instructors said morale had changed overnight, as though someone had lifted a weight from the cockpit. The Merlin engine, that roaring symbol of British ingenuity, was finally free to perform at its true potential. In engagements over Dover, over Calais, and later over the Channel Islands, RAF pilots began holding their dives longer, keeping pursuit through clouds and smoke trails. The Germans noticed the difference. Luftwaffe debriefs mentioned Spitfires maintaining pressure in situations where they had previously broken off. It wasn't brute force that turned the tide. It was reliability. A pilot who trusted his engine could fly with courage. A machine that answered its pilot without falter could change the course of battle. But there was another layer to this story. One, the history. Books often leave untold. Beatrice Shilling's contribution came at a time when women were rarely recognized in military engineering. Her official title was modest, a technical officer at the Royal Aircraft Establishment, Farnborough. Yet the success of her washer spread through RAF bases faster than any memo could. Track commanders began asking for Shilling's device by name. Mechanics traded stories about her arriving in the rain, sleeves rolled up, working elbow-deep in carburetors beside them. To them, she wasn't a bureaucrat or a symbol. She was a comrade. Her fix didn't make her famous in her lifetime. It didn't earn her medals or parades, but in those few months of 1941, it quietly helped save more than 2,000 RAF pilots from certain death. A 50-cent piece of brass, installed by hand, became one of the most vital modifications of the entire war. And for the men who climbed into their Spitfires each morning, it meant one thing above all. They could finally fight on equal terms. The skies over Britain were no longer a place of mechanical disadvantage. They were a test of nerve, skill, and endurance. And now, with the Merlin running true, the RAF was ready to meet that test head-on. Summer 1941. The clouds over the English Channel are alive again, roaring, twisting, burning. The Battle of Britain has officially ended, but the war in the air is far from over. From the white cliffs of Dover to the rolling fields of Kent. The sound of Merlin engines echoes like thunder. And for the first time, the Spitfire pilots have something their enemies no longer possess: confidence. At 20,000 feet, Flight Lieutenant John Freeborn pushes his Spitfire into a vertical dive. Below him, a formation of BF-109s is breaking across the clouds, banking left to scatter. Before Beatrice Shilling's fix, this maneuver would have been unthinkable. A steep dive risked flooding the carburetor, choking the engine mid-combat. Now, with the Miss Shilling's orifice fitted, the Merlin growls without hesitation. Freeborn presses harder, the airframe shudders, the altimeter spins, and vapor streaks form on the wingtips. No cough, no sputter. Only raw power. The Spitfire slices through the cloud cover and fires a burst. Short, precise, merciless. One Messerschmitt spirals down in flames. Reports like these began to flood in through the summer. Months. Squadron 92. Squadron 609. Squadron 74. All confirming the same thing. The E. Spitfire could finally follow the enemy, wherever he fled. At high altitudes, above 25,000 feet, where air thinned and every second of control mattered, pilots described a new freedom of movement. The Merlin's roar didn't fade, even when inverted or diving through turbulence. For the first time, they could fight not just defensively, but aggressively. Meanwhile, across the channel, German mechanics noticed something alarming. Their BF-109s, long the Hunter's aircraft, were now being chased and caught. The Rolls-Royce Merlin, once limited by its carburetor flaw, was now outpacing the Daimler-Benz fuel-injected engines that had given the Luftwaffe its edge. The Luftwaffe's ace pilots, Galland, Mulders, and others, began reporting the change in their after-action notes. They called the Spitfire reborn, unnervingly, nimble, and impossible to shake. Each encounter now tilted just slightly in Britain's favor. A small edge multiplied across hundreds of engagements, and in war, small edges decide destinies. From that summer onward, RAF losses in air duels began to decline. The RAF could sustain longer dogfights, launch offensive sweeps, and hold the initiative over occupied Europe. It wasn't just a machine winning battles anymore. It was the trust between pilot and engine. Rebuilt by a woman few of them had ever met, and as 1941 gave way to 1942, that trust would carry them into one of the most daring chapters of the air war. When the Spitfires took the fight beyond Britain's skies, into the heart of enemy territory. Winter 1942, the war has changed direction. The British are no longer waiting for the Luftwaffe to come. They're crossing the channel themselves. At dawn, the airfields of Tangmere, Hornchurch, and Biggin Hill awaken under freezing fog. Engines growl to life one by one. A chorus of Merlins echoing across the frost-covered tarmac. Spitfires lift into the pale sky, wings gleaming in the cold light, each carrying the tiny metal washer that made this moment possible. Operation Circus, Operation Ramrod, Operation Rodeo, names for the daylight raids meant to bleed the German air defenses and distract them from the Eastern Front. Now, every Spitfire escorting bombers across France owes its survival to Beatrice Shilling's 50-cent invention. Before the fix, pilots would have feared a sudden stall mid-dive. Now, they could drop onto targets, pull high-G turns, and reclimb without hesitation. They could fight on instinct, not on mechanical caution. From the clouds over Dieppe to the skies above Lille, the Spitfire had become more than a symbol. It was a living weapon of balance and grace, no longer mechanically fragile, but perfectly tuned for war. Beatrice, back in her workshop at Farnborough, was still improving designs. Her modification, once dismissed as temporary, had proven so effective that Rolls-Royce integrated the principle into new carburetor systems across all Merlin variants. The same concept soon found its way into Hurricanes, Mustangs, and Mosquito bombers, a quiet revolution hidden inside an orifice no wider than a coin. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe struggled. Their Bf-109Fs and FW-190s still held power. But the psychological shift was undeniable. RAF pilots no longer doubted their machines. Confidence breeds victory. And, over the Channel, that invisible force began tilting history. By mid-1942, the Spitfire McNime emerged, the first major upgrade capable of matching the FW-190 blow for blow. It carried the Merlin 61, refined, efficient, fearless under any maneuver. Every one of those engines still bore the legacy of Shilling's washer. It was no longer just about speed or power. It was about control. A small, almost invisible modification had turned chaos into confidence. And confidence, multiplied across thousands of pilots, had turned defense into offense. In the records of RAF maintenance units, her contribution was filed simply as orifice, restrictor type. But among the pilots, they called it Miss Shilling's orifice. They said it with respect, humor, and gratitude, because they knew exactly what it had saved. That winter, as squadrons returned from missions over France, tired and frostbitten, some pilots wrote her thank you letters that began with the same line, "Your little washer just saved my life." And as the war pressed forward into 1943, that life-saving edge would ripple through every cockpit still fighting for the free world. Spring 1943. The clouds of war still hung heavy over Europe, but the Royal Air Force had changed. Technically, tactically, spiritually, behind every sortie, every victory claim scribbled in chalk on a hangar wall lay a story of invisible innovation. In Farnborough, Beatrice Shilling was no longer just an engineer. She had become a quiet legend. Her invention, once seen as a stopgap measure, was now written into the official Rolls-Royce manuals. Every Merlin carburetor was fitted with her device as standard. Production, no longer a fix, now a feature. The Air Ministry didn't issue medals for washers, but they noticed results. Between 1941 and 1943, combat losses due to engine stalls during combat dives dropped to nearly zero. Pilot confidence reports, once filled with complaints of power loss or vapor lock, now carried only one line: engines reliable at all attitudes. Those simple words meant everything. Every time a Spitfire dived through cloud and reappeared still roaring, every time a pilot pulled hard on the stick and escaped a Bf-109's gun sight, Shilling's precision engineering was at work, unseen, but vital. Yet in the official communiqué, her name rarely appeared. Most men at the front only knew Miss Shilling through her device, a strange little brass disc that saved their lives. They didn't know that she'd raced motorcycles at Brooklands, that she'd once broken the circuit speed record for women, that she tuned engines with the same obsession she brought to war work. She wasn't chasing fame. She was chasing perfection. When asked about her invention after the war, she said quietly, "I just made the engine do what it was supposed to do." But her contribution ran deeper than she admitted. Her work had exposed a truth often forgotten in the machinery of war, that sometimes victory doesn't come from generals or grand strategies. It comes from a single mind, refusing to accept that something good enough can't be made better. And while headlines focused on the Spitfire aces, Johnson, Bader, Deere, back in the workshops, engineers began using the phrase Shilling's principle. It referred to small, precision-focused solutions that changed everything. Meanwhile, the war pressed on. The Merlin's descendants, the Packard-built versions in American Mustangs, still carried her design DNA. When P-51s escorted B-17s over Berlin, when Spitfires covered the D-Day beaches, when mosquitoes flew night raids so fast that radar couldn't keep up, they all owed a silent nod to that one brass washer. Every engine roar across the channel was a note in her mechanical symphony, a war song built on metal, mathematics, and stubborn brilliance. But as the war neared its end, the world began to change again. The jet age was approaching, and with it, a new kind of power, free from carburetors, but not from the lessons Beatrice left behind. 45, the guns fell silent. Europe lay in ruins, cities flattened, skies finally quiet. But in small engineering offices and airfields across Britain, a different kind of rebuilding began. Beatrice Shilling returned to her lab at Farnborough, her hands still stained with the faint ghosts of oil and graphite. Her orifice restrictor, as it was officially known, had become standard in every Merlin engine that survived the war. She didn't have medals pinned to her chest, but she had something rarer: respect from fighter pilots who owed her their lives. Letters came in quietly. One from a Spitfire pilot read simply, "Your little washer kept me flying when my luck had run out." Another wrote, "Ma'am, I didn't know who you were then, but I do now. Thank you." In the male-dominated halls of British engineering, her presence remained unusual. A woman surrounded by slide rules, blueprints, and men twice her size, yet outthinking them all. She continued testing high-speed jet aircraft, helping analyze the first British meteors and later the comets, always chasing precision in a world that had nearly been destroyed by chaos. When the press asked about her role during the war, she waved the attention away with a wry smile. "I just stopped engines from misbehaving," she said. But to the men who flew, she had done far more. She had given them back control when everything else seemed uncontrollable. Over time, her story faded from the headlines, buried beneath the legends of dogfights and daring raids, but among engineers, she became a quiet symbol. Proof that real progress often begins in overlooked corners, in small hands shaping small parts with enormous consequences. In 1980, when Beatrice Shilling passed away, pilots who had once depended on her device were old men now, but they still remembered. Some still kept the brass washer mounted on wooden plaques in their homes, a relic not of war, but of survival. It wasn't just a piece of metal anymore. It was a reminder that genius doesn't always roar. Sometimes it hums, steady, precise, and unstoppable. The Spitfire would go down in history as Britain's aerial icon, sleek, graceful, unbeatable. But behind that perfection, hidden beneath aluminum skin and roaring engines, was the touch of one woman and her 50-cent idea that helped save 2,100 pilots and turn the course of air combat. History often celebrates the machines, the Spitfire, the Merlin, the power, the speed, the victories. But behind every roar of an engine was a whisper of human thought, a mind that refused to accept good enough. Beatrice Shilling was never on the front lines. She didn't drop bombs or dogfight over the channel. She worked in silence, in grease-stained overalls, surrounded by parts too small to notice. Yet her precision shaped destiny. In a war built on destruction, she created something that saved. Her washer didn't just fix an engine. It restored confidence to every pilot who took to the sky, knowing his aircraft would answer when life depended on it. That's the hidden truth of World War II. II's triumphs. They weren't only forged by generals or politicians. They were built by people whose names history almost forgot. Mechanics, engineers, codebreakers, mathematicians, and yes, one quiet woman with a file and a dream of perfection. The skies over Britain still echo with that spirit. The Spitfires that remain, preserved, polished, and flown on Memorial Days, carry her legacy within their engines. Every turn of the propeller is a tribute to the mind that turned a flaw into an advantage, a weakness into survival. In the grand sweep of war, Beatrice Shilling's invention may have seemed small, but so does every act of courage, until it saves a life. Because sometimes, history doesn't change in the roar of battle. It changes in the quiet moment when one person decides to make something just a little bit better.